The house I built with love would one day become the stage for my betrayal. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. My name's Edward Harris. Though everyone calls me Ed, I've been a carpenter, a husband and a father, but above all, a builder, not just of houses, but of dreams. When my father died at 17, I learned that if I wanted something lasting, I'd have to build it myself. I worked every job that would take me, construction sites in the heat, night shifts where my hands froze on the hammer. Every spare dollar went into a cigar box under my bed. That was my promise to myself. One day I'd build a home that could hold laughter. It took 11 years to save enough to buy a small patch of land outside town. Weeds everywhere, soil hard as stone. But when I stood there with a shovel, I could already see walls, windows, a porch swing catching sunset. So I built. Days for other men's houses, nights for mine. The smell of sawdust clung to me like a second skin. When others went drinking, I sanded door frames. When they fished on Sundays, I poured concrete. There's a holiness in watching something rise from nothing. The slow rhythm of progress, one wall, one board, one breath at a time. My favorite part was the porch, wide enough for a swing, facing west so the light always came home. When I drove the last nail, I pressed my hand to the siding and whispered, "We did it." That house became my anchor. When my wife passed, I buried my grief in those walls, painting, fixing, mending, until sorrow turned into pride. I raised my boy, Michael, there. Every birthday, every storm, every smell of dinner belonged to that roof. Michael never knew the hunger or worry I had. His shoes always fit. His bed was always warm, because I made sure of it. Maybe I made it too easy. I wanted him to start where I'd once dreamed of ending. When he married Samantha, I moved downstairs to my den and gave them the run of the place. "This is yours now," I told him. "Raise your kids here. Keep the walls strong." It wasn't a legal handoff. The deed still had my name, but in my heart I'd given it away. Their children, Liam and Grace, filled the rooms with laughter again. The house loved them. You can feel it when the floors creak kindly instead of complaining. I fixed the fence, sharpened the mower, taught Liam how to tell a Phillips from a flathead, let Grace help me paint the porch rail. On quiet evenings I sat outside, sunlight soaking into the wood, and thought, this is what I built it for. Samantha was polite, always said thank you, but her smile never touched her eyes. She didn't like my tools on the porch or the dented kettle I used for tea. She replaced the sturdy oak chairs I'd built with thin chrome ones from a catalogue. Harmless things maybe, but they left marks you couldn't sand out. Michael stayed busy. Emails, deadlines, glowing phone in hand. I told myself that's what ambition looks like. I kept my corner tidy downstairs. A rocking chair that fit my shoulders, a lamp with a pull chain that clicked twice before shining, and 3 photo albums in a neat row. Sometimes I'd open them and walk through old pictures, my wife holding baby Michael, me standing beside the porch before the paint dried. I believed my old age would be gentle, evenings with family. Stories retold until the kids rolled their eyes, but smiled anyway. I thought I'd earned quiet after years of noise, but life doesn't always honor your work. The cracks began small, not in the walls, but in the people. Samantha called the house dated. She said the neighborhood wasn't modern enough. Michael agreed without looking at me. My handmade chairs ended up under a tarp in the garage. Labels appeared on the pantry shelves, like soldiers in a neat line. The house that once breathed now whispered in someone else's language. Sometimes I'd hear Samantha telling the kids, "Grandpa's just old-fashioned." Old-fashioned. That word cut deeper than any chisel. Still, I believed in family harmony. I told myself love could weather anything. I poured tea, kept quiet, and stayed useful. Mowing, fixing, showing gratitude just for being there. I convinced myself that one day they'd see the house the way I did, not as old wood, but as history still standing. Each night I sat in my chair, the porch light throwing gold across the yard, and reminded myself why I'd built it and for them. For a family that could rest easy, because I'd done the hard part, even when Samantha's voice cooled another few degrees, even when Michael began speaking to me like a visitor in his home, I held my tongue. A builder knows the difference between damage and settling. I thought this was settling, but looking back maybe I should have heard it. The quiet strain in the beams, the warning creak before a break. Because sometimes, when you build something with love, you forget to believe it can still fall apart. I walked the rooms at night, touching the walls, remembering how every nail had gone in straight. I whispered to the empty air, "They'll remember what this house stands for. I was wrong. I used to think a house only creaked when it settled. Turns out it also creaks when it starts to break. At first it was nothing worth naming, small things that didn't fit right anymore." Samantha changed the curtains, said the old ones made the rooms feel heavy. She replaced the hand-carved chairs I'd built with chrome ones that pinched when you sat too long. "They're modern," she said, smiling that tight smile that meant you wouldn't understand. Michael just nodded. "She's making it home, Dad. Home. Funny word to use for something already built." I didn't argue. I'd learned that silence lasts longer than pride. I told myself every generation adds its own coat of paint. Still, the air felt different, colder, cleaner in a way that stripped the warmth right out of it. One evening, Samantha set new plates on the table, white, thin, the kind that clink like glass when you breathe wrong. My wife's old dishes were gone. When I asked, she said, "Oh, they had chips." I donated them. She meant well, maybe. But the house seemed to shrink after that. The grandkids still ran through the halls, and their laughter kept me going. I fixed their toy box, mended Liam's bike, helped Grace build her first birdhouse. But little by little, even they stopped coming to the den. Samantha filled their heads with, "Grandpa needs rest," or "Don't bother him when he's working." Working? I hadn't built a thing in months. Michael started spending more nights at the office. I understood hard work. It was the one language I spoke fluently. But when he came home, he barely looked up from his phone. "Long day," he'd say. "I'll eat later." I'd sit in my chair downstairs, listening to the muffled television through the floorboards. Sometimes I'd stare at the family photos on the wall, my wife smiling, Michael as a boy with cake on his face, and I'd wonder when those pictures had become ghosts. The house began to whisper, not with wind or wood, but with words not meant for me. Samantha on the phone. "It's exhausting living with someone who doesn't get it," or Michael's low voice in the kitchen. "He's just set in his ways." One Sunday morning, I overheard the quietest conversation of all. Samantha said, "Maybe it's time he found a smaller place, somewhere he can be comfortable." Michael didn't answer right away. "Then, he loves this house. I don't think he'd ever leave." She sighed. "Then we'll have to help him." That word, help, hung in the air like a draft you can't seal. After that, I tried to stay useful. I trimmed the hedge, patched the porch rail, fixed the basement pipes that no one else would touch. Samantha barely noticed. Michael thanked me with distracted eyes. I told myself not to take it personally. Kids don't mean harm, not at first. They just forget who taught them how to stand. But the forgetting got louder. They redecorated the living room without asking, painted the walls white, moved my old rocking chair to the basement for space. The smell of fresh paint covered the scent of sawdust that had lived there for decades. And then one night, Samantha's voice floated down the stairs. "Your father's losing his touch. He left his tools out again." Michael answered, "He's getting old." "Don't be hard on him." "I'm not," she said. "I'm just saying we can't keep baby-proofing everything for him." Baby-proofing. The word hit me like a hammer to the ribs. Later that week, Michael came to me with that polite tone people use when they've already decided something. "Dad, we're taking the kids on vacation next week. You'll have the house to yourself. Maybe get some rest," I smiled. "Rest sounds good." He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "Before we go, could you check the pipes in the basement one last time? They've been making noise again." Of course I agreed. I'd built those pipes, run every inch myself. I told him I'd take a look after they left. The morning they packed the car, Samantha waved a quick goodbye. Michael hugged me, distracted, phone in one hand. "Thanks, Dad. You're the best." The house fell silent after the engine faded down the street. For the first time in years, I heard it breathe. The floorboards sighed, the fridge hummed, the clock ticked steady on the wall. I made myself tea and stood at the window, watching the dust settle in the light. I should have known something was wrong, should have seen it in the way Samantha looked back once before getting in the car, the quick flick of her eyes toward the house, not me. But love blinds a builder. We trust our structures until they fail. That evening, I took my tools and headed to the basement like I'd promised. The stairs creaked under my weight. I turned the light on, the old bulb flickered, same as always, and knelt beside the pipes. I remember humming to myself, a tune my wife used to sing while cooking. Then I heard it, a soft click behind me, the unmistakable sound of a lock sliding home. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe my imagination, but when I tried the door, it wouldn't budge. The realization hit slow, like a crack spreading through glass. They hadn't asked me to check the pipes. They'd asked me to disappear. I pressed my hand against the door, called out once, twice, nothing. Only the hollow echo of my own voice. Somewhere above, the house settled again. The same house I'd built to protect them. I stood there in the flickering light, breathing the cold metallic air and whispered, "So this is what help looks like." For the first few minutes, I told myself it was a mistake. Maybe the door had swollen from the humidity. Maybe the latch had jammed. I pushed harder, jiggled the knob, even called out Michael's name as if he might appear laughing, apologizing. But the silence that answered was clean and cold. The bulb above me buzzed like an insect, flickering shadows across the concrete. I stood in that half-light and listened to the house settle above me, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant tick of the hallway clock, sounds that once meant home, but now felt foreign, like I was hearing them from another life. They'd left a tray on the old workbench, half a loaf of bread, a thermos of water, and a note in Samantha's handwriting, "For the weekend. Please stay downstairs." The pest control guy sprayed. I stared at the words until they blurred. Pest control. That's what I'd become. Anger didn't come right away. It arrived slow, like water seeping through cracks. I sat on the old stool and stared at my hands, scarred, swollen, steady. The same hands that had built every inch of that house, and that once held my son when he was too small to stand. I ran my fingers over the workbench, over the grain of the wood I'd planned decades ago. My name was still carved faintly into one corner. E.H., 1987. Back then, I'd believed names lasted forever if you etched them deep enough. The hours crawled by. The bulb hummed, dimmed, hummed again. The air smelled of dust and iron. I thought of the basement as I'd first poured it, back when Michael was 10 and afraid of storms. I'd told him, "This basement will always keep you safe." And now, it was my cage. Sometime after midnight, I started laughing, quietly at first, then louder until it echoed off the walls. It wasn't madness. It was the kind of laughter that comes when pain finally stops surprising you. When I stopped, I whispered into the silence, "You can't trap the man who built your walls." I got up, calm now, and began to look around. Old habits returned. A builder's mind always searches for exits. I checked the small window near the ceiling, sealed tight with new screws. Clever. Michael must have done that when they remodeled. I tested the hinges on the door. Solid oak, no give. But the lock, that old brass deadbolt, I remembered installing it myself, back when Samantha first moved in. She'd said she wanted extra safety. I told her the model number, the one flaw in its design. She probably never listened. In the corner of the workbench lay a coffee tin filled with odds and ends, screws, wire, nails. I poured it out, sifting through until my fingers found a small bent nail, rusted but sharp. My mind began to work the way it used to when I fixed things that couldn't be fixed. I sat on the floor, breathing steady, and slid the nail into the keyhole. The first few tries failed, too shallow, too fast. I slowed down, listened for the soft click, the language of metal against metal. My hands shook, not from fear, but from memory. Then click. The sound was so gentle, I almost didn't believe it. I turned the knob. The door creaked open an inch, spilling a line of warm light across the floor. I stood there for a long time staring at it. Freedom shouldn't feel that quiet. When I stepped out, the house was still and dim. A faint smell of perfume hung in the air, Samantha's. On the counter sat their empty coffee mugs, rinsed but still wet. I looked around at everything I had built, every beam, every joint, every nail, and felt something shift inside me. The anger cooled, hardened into something else. Resolve. They thought I'd be too weak to fight back, that I'd stay in that basement, grateful for bread and silence. They'd forgotten what kind of man built this place. I walked from room to room, like a ghost, reclaiming his own story. The porch light was still on, just as I'd left it. My old rocking chair sat on the porch covered in dust. I brushed it off and sat down. The night air was cool, the stars sharp above the roofline. For a long while I just breathed, the deep kind of breathing you do when something inside you is being remade. Then I made my first real decision. In the morning I'd find the deed. The papers were somewhere in the den, tucked in the old file cabinet beneath the tax folders. I remembered the weight of that drawer, the sound it made when you pulled it out. I'd kept everything, receipts, blueprints, original purchase documents, all the proof that this house, every square inch of it, was still mine. I went back inside and sat in the den until dawn. The first light hit the walls, golden and soft, the same way it had the day I finished building them. When the sun was fully up, I pulled open the cabinet. There it was, the original deed, the ink faded but clear. Owner, Edward Harris, my name. Still there. I ran a thumb over the paper, then folded it carefully into my jacket pocket. The house creaked again, almost approvingly. For the first time in years, it didn't sound tired. It sounded alive. I brewed myself tea in the dented kettle Samantha hated and sat at the table, reading the morning light like scripture. They had locked me away in the dark, thinking they'd silenced me. But the truth was simpler. They'd given me time to remember what I owned and who I was. As the clock ticked toward 8, I spoke aloud just once. You thought you buried me in the basement, but I was only building my way out. And with that, I stood up, folded the deed into my pocket, and began to plan the quietest revenge of my life. By sunrise, the house was mine again, at least in silence, if not yet in law. The light coming through the kitchen window landed exactly where it had on the first morning I moved in decades ago. Back then, I'd stood right there with coffee and pride. Now I stood with something colder. I laid the deed flat on the table, smoothing the creases with my thumb. The ink had faded to brown, but my name was still sharp enough to sting. Edward Harris, owner. All those years, I'd kept the paperwork tucked safely in a drawer, more out of sentiment than caution. I never imagined it would one day be my lifeline. I brewed tea in that old dented kettle, one more thing Samantha had called outdated, and sat at the table, listening to the whistle rise. Funny, I thought, how the things people discard are usually the ones that keep working. The house felt strange that morning, empty but alert, like it knew change was coming. I ate a slice of bread from the tray they'd left me. Poison or pity, it didn't matter, and thought about what to do next. I wasn't the kind of man who shouted or broke things. I'd learned long ago that the quietest moves make the deepest marks. After breakfast, I dug out the old phone book I kept by the sink. I flipped through pages that smelled like dust and fingerprints until I found the number. Tom Reynolds, Realtor. I'd known Tom for 30 years. He'd helped me once sell a small property when my wife got sick. Honest man, always wore clean boots and spoke softly, like every deal was a prayer. When he answered, his voice was exactly the same. Tom Reynolds Real Estate. Tom, I said, calm and steady. This is Ed Harris. A pause. Ed, been a long time. How are you, old friend? Older, I said, and ready to sell. Sell? You mean your house? That's the one. He hesitated. You sure, Ed? That place is, well, that's your legacy. Legacies rot if you leave them in the wrong hands, I said quietly. I want it gone before the weekend's over. He didn't ask for details. All right, I'll be there this afternoon. We'll talk options. When I hung up, I looked around the kitchen one more time. The walls Samantha had painted white, the empty space where my wife's dishes had sat for years. I felt no sorrow now, just clarity. Tom showed up right on time, as he always had, in his brown pickup truck and clean plaid shirt. When he stepped inside, he took off his hat and looked around. "Still solid as ever," he said, tapping a wall. "You don't build 'em like this anymore?" "Not many of us left to remember how," I replied. We sat at the table, the deed between us. Tom read it, nodding slowly. "Everything's in your name, Ed. Taxes up to date. You kept good records. Always did." He hesitated again, lowering his voice. "You want to tell me why now?" I looked him square in the eye. "Because some people forgot who built this place. I'm just reminding them who still owns it." That was all he needed. He opened his folder and started laying out forms. "We can do a private listing. I know a few buyers who'll take something like this for cash. No inspections, no fuss. How fast?" 7 days, maybe less. Depends on how clean the title comes back." "It'll be clean," he nodded. "Then we'll make it happen." We spent the next hour walking the house. Tom took photos, kitchen, living room, porch, yard. When he got to the basement door, he turned. "Still dry down there?" "Dry enough," I said. He didn't ask to go inside, and I didn't offer. That night I stayed up late at the kitchen table, reading through old bills, receipts, insurance statements, everyone with my name printed clearly. Ownership is a funny thing. You can give people everything, time, space, shelter, and they'll still forget whose hands made it possible. But paper doesn't forget. The house creaked again in the quiet. Not the sad kind of creak I'd heard for months, but a deep, approving groan, like the sound of something stretching back into shape. I took out a small notebook and began writing a list. Call the bank in the morning, gather IDs and tax slips, clear out personal items before Thursday, leave the rest. Let the walls speak for themselves. Before going to bed, I walked from room to room, touching the corners, the trim, the doors I'd hung by hand. I didn't feel bitterness anymore, only purpose. In Michael's old bedroom, I paused at the window. Outside, the moonlight traced the outline of the porch I'd built with him when he was 12. He'd wanted to help, proud of his little hammer, missing half the nails, but smiling the whole time. I could still hear him saying, "Dad, one day this will be mine." He'd been right. I'd made it his, but not in the way he'd imagined. The next morning I walked to the bank. The teller, a young woman with tired eyes, smiled politely. "Good morning, sir." "How can I help you?" "I need to confirm the ownership of a property and prepare for a sale," I said. She typed for a few minutes, then looked up. "Yes, Mr. Harris, the title records show you as the sole owner. No lines, no secondary claims." "Good," I said. That's all I needed. I left the bank lighter. The world outside felt sharper, clearer, even the air easier to breathe. Back home, I called Tom again. "Everything checks out," I told him. "Perfect," he said. "I'll bring the listing papers tomorrow. We'll set a price, but I've got buyers in mind already. How fast can we close?" He chuckled. "You're in a hurry. Let's just say time's worth more than money now." He paused, maybe hearing something in my tone, then said, "We'll do it right." "Ed, don't you worry." "I'm not worried," I said. "Not anymore." That evening I stood in the den one last time and opened the old photo album. There was my wife, smiling under the porch light, Michael a toddler on her hip. The house behind them looked new, alive, proud. I touched the photo and whispered, "You'd understand." Then I closed the book and put it in the box I'd packed with a few other keepsakes. Her necklace, my father's hammer, the square I'd used on every beam. The rest I'd leave behind. I sat on the porch until the sky dimmed to copper, the smell of rain hanging in the air. I didn't feel old anymore. I felt ready. By the weekend, they'd come home to a sign in the yard they'd never expect. Red letters, bold and final, sold, and by then, I'd be long gone. There's a certain calm that comes before justice, not the noisy courtroom kind, but the quiet kind that happens when a man finally reclaims what's his. By Friday morning, the deal was already in motion. Tom called early, his voice steady as ever. "Got 2 serious buyers lined up, Ed. Both cash offers, no inspections. You all right if I bring them this afternoon?" "I'll have coffee ready," I said. He chuckled softly. "You always do." When I hung up, I looked around the kitchen. Samantha's white walls, her polished counters, the sterile perfection she'd painted over my life. In a few hours, strangers would be walking through, seeing it for what it really was. A strong old house with better bones than its owners ever deserved. I spent the next hour tidying up, not for them, but for me. I wiped down the table, dusted the mantel, and set out the dented kettle on the stove. That kettle had survived everything: storms, grief, time. I wanted it to be the last thing that whistled here. The buyers arrived with Tom right on time. A middle-aged couple, both polite, the kind who respect craftsmanship. The man ran his hand along the banister, nodding. "Solid work here." "Real oak?" I smiled. "Cut and fitted by hand. Held up 40 years. He whistled softly. "Doesn't creak much." "That's rare." They walked through the house with quiet appreciation, not the fake enthusiasm I'd seen in people who buy homes just to flip them. These two looked like they'd live here. Maybe they'd even listen when the floors spoke at night. Tom handled the talking. I just stood near the window, watching sunlight shift across the porch. I could hear the low hum of their voices. Great layout, lots of character. It feels honest. Honest. That word hit me harder than it should have. When they left, Tom smiled. "They're in. Cash offer over asking. They'll wire a deposit within the hour." "That's fast," I said. "Good houses don't stay on the market. Ed, they find new people quick, the kind who deserve them." "Then it's settled," I said, and handed him the signed listing sheet. He looked at me for a long second. "You sure about this?" "You could rent it out, keep some income rolling in." I shook my head. "No, I don't rent what's sacred. Either you build it or you let it go." He nodded like he understood, though maybe not completely. That night I slept better than I had in months. No nightmares, no memories replaying. Just peace. The next morning Tom called again. "Wires cleared. Title checks clean. We close Monday." "Perfect," I said. "Let's keep it that way." He laughed softly. "You always liked things straight and level." "I still do." After we hung up, I started gathering my things. Not many, just a small suitcase, a few tools, and a shoebox of memories. My wife's photograph, our wedding ring, the square I used on every beam of the house. Everything else I left untouched. I moved slowly through each room, taking one last look. The living room where we'd spent Christmases, the kitchen where my wife used to hum while she cooked, the hallway where Michael had taken his first steps. Every memory seemed to watch me back. When I reached the den, I opened the drawer and found the old brass key to the basement. I turned it over in my hand, heavy, worn smooth from years of use. For a moment, I thought about throwing it away, but then I smiled. Some symbols deserve to stay. I placed it on the kitchen counter, right in the center on a folded white napkin. A message without words. On Sunday afternoon, Tom stopped by with the final papers. We sat on the porch while he explained the details. "Everything's ready. Buyers are happy. Once you sign here and here, it's done. Money's already waiting in your account." I took the pen and signed slowly, carefully, as though every stroke carved something permanent. When it was done, Tom extended his hand. "Congratulations, Ed, that's that." "Yeah," I said softly. "That's that." He hesitated, eyes narrowing slightly. "You know, most people get sentimental selling their homes. You seem peaceful." I looked out toward the road, where the wind moved through the trees. "Peace doesn't come from holding on, Tom. Sometimes it comes from letting go, the right way." He nodded. "You're a rare one, Ed." "I just measure twice before cutting once," I said, half smiling. That night I walked through the house one last time. No sadness, no regret, just finality. The moonlight through the windows painted silver on the floorboards, soft and clean. I stopped by the front door and ran my hand along the frame. Solid, level, still true after all these years. "You did good," I whispered to the wood. "You held us together as long as you could." Then I stepped outside, locking the door behind me for the last time. I stood on the porch, breathing in the cool night air. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear a car on the highway, a train horn low and steady. The world keeps moving. Houses change hands. But the things that truly belong to you, pride, dignity, justice, those stay fixed. I took one last look at the home I'd built. The porch swing moved slightly in the breeze, creaking like an old friend saying goodbye. Tomorrow the papers would be filed, the sale complete. Michael and Samantha would come home to a stranger's car in the driveway and a red sold sign staked deep into the yard. Their keys wouldn't fit. Their house, their inheritance, their comfort, their pride would be gone, and I wouldn't be there to explain. Some stories don't need explanations, only endings. I picked up my suitcase, turned toward the road, and walked away as dawn began to break. The house stood behind me, still proud, still silent, no longer theirs, not quite mine, but exactly where it needed to be. For the first time in years, I felt taller, freer, like a man stepping out from under his own roof and finally seeing the sky. The following Friday, the sale went through without a hitch. Tom texted me at noon. Funds cleared. Property transferred. Congrats, Ed. I stared at the message for a long time, then powered the phone off. That single sentence had more peace in it than anything I'd heard in years. I spent that evening by the sea, in my small rented room, sitting on the balcony with my tea. The sound of the waves filled the silence where guilt might have lived. I didn't feel guilt, just completion. By morning, the peace broke like a tide pulling back. My phone started buzzing. First once, then twice, then 5 times in a row. Michael, I let it ring. The sound cut through the quiet air like a hammer on old wood. After the 7th call, I finally picked up. Dad? His voice cracked, a tone I hadn't heard since he was a boy. What's going on? There are people in the house, movers. They said we don't live here anymore. I didn't answer right away. The sea hissed softly in the background. They showed us papers, he went on. Your name, the signatures, it's all real. Tell me this is a mistake. It's not, I said simply. There was silence, then the sound of his breath tightening. You sold the house. Yes, but that's our house. No, I said. It was mine. And I gave it up long ago. You just never realized who it belonged to. Dad, how could you do that? Where are we supposed to go? The kids, I cut him off. You locked me in the basement, Michael. That was Samantha's idea, he stammered. We didn't mean it was for your safety. You've been forgetful lately. We thought, I laughed low and quiet. Forgetful? Son, I remember every board of that house, every nail, every bruise it gave me. You didn't lock me up for safety. You did it for convenience. He was silent. I could hear Samantha's voice in the background, sharp and frantic. Then Michael said, you could have just asked us to leave. You didn't have to sell it. That was cruel. Cruel, I repeated. Cruel is locking your father underground with bread and a note. Cruel is erasing the man who built your comfort. What I did was justice. Calm, legal, and final. He exhaled hard, anger finally pushing through the fear. We'll fight this. We'll take it to court. You can try, I said. But the deed, the taxes, the bills, all in my name. You never cared enough to change them. I built that house, Michael. I made every payment, laid every brick. You just lived in it like a guest who overstayed. He went quiet again. Dad, he said finally, voice breaking. You can't mean this. Where are we supposed to go? I looked at the horizon, at the endless stretch of water, and said softly, somewhere you build yourself. Maybe then you'll understand what a home really is. Please, he whispered. Don't do this, I sighed. I already did, and I hung up. For a long time I sat there, the wind tugging gently at my sleeves. I thought I'd feel triumphant, but what I felt instead was something simpler, balance. The kind of quiet that settles when things finally align the way they should. I could picture them now, pulling into the driveway, smiles fading as they saw the sold sign in the yard. The new couple standing on their porch with boxes, the confusion turning to panic. Samantha shouting, Michael fumbling with his keys, realizing the lock didn't fit anymore. The image wasn't revenge. It was symmetry. I imagined the neighbors watching from their windows, whispering. The old man sold it. Maybe some of them would call it heartless. Maybe others would nod and say, serves them right. People like to label justice. They don't understand that sometimes justice doesn't roar. It just closes a door. That night, Michael called again. I let it go to voicemail. His voice trembled through the speaker. Dad, we're staying at a motel. The kids are crying. Samantha won't talk to me. I don't know what to do. Please. Just call me back. I didn't. The next day, Tom called. Ed, I got a strange voicemail from your son. Sounds like he's upset. "You doing all right?" "I'm fine," I said. "He'll learn." Tom paused, then spoke softly. "You sure you're okay with all this?" "Tom," I said, "I didn't sell the house out of spite. I sold it out of memory. I wanted it to belong to someone who still knows how to listen when wood creaks." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're one of a kind, Ed." "Just a man with a hammer," I replied, and hung up. That evening I walked down to the water. The sea smelled of salt and clean beginnings. I took the old basement key from my pocket, the one I'd kept like a scar, and turned it over in my hand. The brass had dulled, edges worn smooth from decades of use. I whispered, "You were the last lock that tried to hold me." Then I threw it into the sea. It flashed once in the sunlight before vanishing beneath the waves. I stood there until the tide touched my boots, the horizon melting into gold. Somewhere inland, my son was learning what it meant to lose something built by someone else's hands. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel buried by my own history. I felt free from it. It's strange, the quiet that follows justice. It isn't loud or proud, it just is. Like the air after a storm, clean, calm, and honest. A week had passed since the sale. The world had kept moving, but inside me, something had finally stopped turning. I rented a small place by the coast. Nothing fancy, just a one-room cottage with peeling paint, a squeaky door, and a view that made it all worth it. Mornings smelled of salt and coffee. Evenings hummed with the rhythm of waves against stone. For the first time in years, I slept through the night. No creaks above my head, no muffled arguments through walls that used to feel too close. Just wind, ocean, and peace. Every morning I brewed tea in my old dented kettle, the same one Samantha once said belonged in the trash, and sat by the window watching fishermen pull their boats in. Some mornings I'd nod to them as they passed by. They didn't know my story, and I didn't owe it to them. Around here, people mind their own business. They fix what's broken, and they keep moving. That's how I like it. One evening, I went for a walk along the beach with my hands in my pockets, the sea air cool against my face. My fingers brushed something small and cold, the photo I always kept folded up. My wife, young again, holding baby Michael on the porch of the house I built. The boards behind them were raw, unpainted, full of promise. I stopped walking and looked at it under the fading light. My wife's smile seemed to hold everything I'd forgotten. Patience, love, forgiveness. "We did it, didn't we?" I whispered. "We built something that lasted, because even though the house was gone, what it stood for hadn't died with it. It was still in the way I measured things by hand, in the way I treated strangers with quiet dignity, in the way I never once raised my voice to the people who wronged me. The house might have been sold, but my principles, those beams, stayed upright. I sat on a driftwood log and watched the sunset smear gold over the water. Somewhere out there, Michael was learning what a home truly means. Maybe he'd rent a small apartment, fix something broken himself, teach his kids how to swing a hammer. Maybe one day he'd understand what I meant when I said a house isn't a gift, it's a responsibility. For now, that was enough for me. Later that night, I sat at my small table, writing in a notebook I'd started calling The Second Foundation. Each page held lessons I wanted to leave behind. Not for Michael, but for anyone who'd ever forgotten where they came from. I wrote, "A house built with love can't be destroyed by betrayal, only inherited wrongly. And when the ungrateful take what they haven't earned, let time and truth do your work. Justice doesn't always knock. Sometimes it signs papers." I smiled, closed the notebook, and leaned back in my chair. The sea breeze slipped through the cracked window, carrying the sound of waves like breathing. Outside, the moon rose, full and bright, the same one that used to hang over my old porch when life still felt simple. Back then I thought legacy meant walls and roofs. Now I knew better. Legacy is living long enough to see your mistakes and still having the courage to correct them. I poured another cup of tea and stepped out onto the porch. The wood creaked under my feet, familiar in its imperfection. I looked up at the stars and thought of all the years I'd spent trying to build permanence in a world that changes no matter how strong you make it. You can build walls, but love, respect, and memory, those are the real materials that hold a life together. And when those rot, It's better to start over than to patch what's too far gone. A soft breeze brushed against me, and for a second I could almost hear my wife's voice again. Calm, patient, kind. "You did right, Ed," she seemed to say. I closed my eyes and whispered back, "I hope so." Then I turned, looked toward the sea, and said out loud the last words I'll ever say about that old house. He thought he buried me in the basement. But I was only building my way out, the waves answered, rolling steady and endless against the shore, carrying the past out with the tide. And for the first time since I drove that last nail into the porch so many years ago, I felt the same thing I did that day, and not pride, not sorrow, just peace, true, quiet peace.